So thanks, Martha. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here at the Center for Neuroscience and Society this year. So I'm going to start off today just by doing a little bit of show and tell, because everybody loves show and tell. And I'm going to show you two of these non-invasive consumer brain stimulation devices. So the first one I have here is called the Cognitive Kit. I'll hold it up, you can see it. This is a version of it. It costs about $150. It's been available on the market for a few years now. Inside here there's a 9-volt battery. You dip these sponges in saline solution. You put them in here. You attach them, or you put them in a certain orientation on your head, held together by a headband. You flip the switch on and the device delivers a current to your brain, a very low level of current. So that's one device. You can have a look at it after if you want. I'll leave it up here. There's another device that just came out in June called the Think. It's this little white triangle over here. And Think is marketed either for energy vibes or for calm vibes. So this is according to the company. So they say that the energy vibes are supposed to replace a cup of coffee, and the calm vibes are supposed to replace a glass of wine. So you take this thing, connect it to this disposable electrode sort of thing that they invented, just like this. Are you wondering if I'm going to turn it on? Do you feel the suspense in here? I'm not going to do it right now, but you basically take this, there's adhesives, and you put it on your head. So one connects here, one connects there, and it pairs with your smartphone. You press go, and it also gives you electrical brain stimulation. So again, they have calm vibes, energy vibes, and I just got an email last week that they have a new kind of calm vibe called holiday bliss, which is very interesting. So today the talk is really going to be about these devices, where they came from, who uses them, and what the regulatory status of them is. I'm not going to focus so much on the science of electrical brain stimulation. For that I recommend looking at Roy Hamilton's talk, which he gave at the same forum last month, and it's currently online on the Center for Neuroscience and Society website and on the YouTube channel. So, where's my clicker? There we go. So I'm going to divide this into about 3 parts. So I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to brain stimulation, a specific kind of brain stimulation called tDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation. I'm going to talk a bit about the rise of the home use movement, the people who make these devices and use them at home. I'm going to talk a bit about the practices of do-it-yourself brain stimulation, what these people do, and specifically at how they interact with scientific publications and published scientific literature. And the last part of the talk, I'm going to get into the regulation of these devices. So we'll start with tDCS. So transcranial direct current stimulation is a form of non-invasive brain stimulation. And that's, well, I should say the Think device claims not to use tDCS. It uses a different kind of stimulation. It's proprietary, so they don't let us know what kind of stimulation it is. Almost all of the other devices that I'm going to talk about today do use a form of tDCS. So basically, at its most basic form, tDCS consists of a battery with 2 wires coming out of it, and at the end of each wire is an electrode, and when those electrodes are placed on the scalp, the electrical circuit closes, and it's thought that this device delivers a low level of current to the brain. And where the anode is placed, so the brain area beneath the anode, so that's where the current's flowing in, that's thought to increase in cortical excitability. So basically, it's not causing the neurons to fire, but basically providing a very low level of electrical stimulation to that region, kind of making it easier for neurons to fire. And where the current's coming out is thought to decrease cortical excitability, so making it a little bit harder for the neurons to fire. I should say that that's a very simplistic model that hasn't really been holding up with more recent studies, but that's still, I guess, the going thought in tDCS, that where you put the anode, that increases the ability to fire, and the cathode decreases it. This is what tDCS looks like on a subject. And in contrast to other techniques that stimulate the brain with electricity or magnetism, I think tDCS is really unique in 2 ways. So one, is that it's non-invasive, so it sits outside the skull. So you have other techniques like deep brain stimulation, which are invasive, so something's implanted inside the body there. That's a treatment for Parkinson's disease. And another thing that I think is unique about tDCS is that it's very easy to replicate. So again, like you have here, this is basically, if I open this up, there's a 9-volt battery in there. It's pretty simple. So unlike other technologies, so transcranial magnetic stimulation that uses different kinds of magnetic coils to stimulate the brain, that's a bit harder to replicate. You can't really make that in your own basement very easily. And TMS is approved, FDA approved treatment for depression, and tDCS is not currently approved, FDA approved as a treatment for any indication. So where did tDCS come from? Well, electricity has been used on the body for thousands of years, dating back to the Roman times before they even had a concept of electricity. So electric fish, and this here is the torpedo ray, they were used to treat headache and gout. They just basically put them on different parts of the body. Electricity was used throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century for medical treatment, so it's pretty much been continuously used in some way, or people have at least tried to use it for treatment for a long time. But in 2000, there was a paper published by 2 German neurophysiologists, Michael Nietzsche and Walter Paulus, and they showed that passing a very low level of electrical current through the brain caused human subjects, to perform better on motor tasks. And that really started this modern day use of tDCS. So what they used became known as transcranial direct current stimulation, tDCS. And when most people think of electrical brain stimulation, the first thing that many people think of is electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. And ECT is a much higher level of current, so that's on the order of 600 to 800 milliamps, and that actually causes a seizure in the brain. It makes the neurons fire. So tDCS, again, is very low level, on the order of 1 to 2 milliamps, so it's hundreds of times less current, and again, it just sort of primes the neurons, makes it easier for them to fire, where there's anodal stimulation. And you could see in the last 15 years, mentions of tDCS in the academic press have really increased dramatically. Do I have? Oh, there we go. And even just in the last 5 years alone, yeah, so this graph is academic journal publications about tDCS through 2014. So you can see in the last 5 years alone, it's really increased dramatically. And tDCS research falls into 2 main groups. So studies on clinical populations, which examine the use of tDCS in treatment for a variety of medical and psychiatric diseases, and studies in healthy populations that examine the use of tDCS for a variety of cognitive functions. So you've probably heard that called cognitive enhancement. So people look at the effect of tDCS on learning, memory, and whether tDCS can enhance cognitive function, make you learn better, faster, acquire motor skills faster, things like that. So where did this do-it-yourself, this home use of tDCS movement begin? So it's not totally clear. There's not a single starting point. But in 2007, starting in 2007, there's isolated mentions of the home use of tDCS, of people making their own devices at home. But around late 2011, early 2012, there's suddenly an explosion when we see websites, blogs, and videos all dedicated to the home use of tDCS. And people are posting diagrams of their homemade devices, communicating on the Reddit forum, which is still the most active nexus of communication today, posting videos on YouTube, how to make the devices, and posting videos in themselves as they're stimulating themselves with tDCS. And I think this late 2011, early 2012 start date for do-it-yourself tDCS, DIY tDCS, is really interesting. Because if you look between 2010 and 2011 here, you see academic mentions of tDCS more than double over here. And if you look at number of print media mentions of tDCS, between 2011 and 2012, there's another big increase. So the do-it-yourself tDCS movement seems to correlate with the media, the rise in media publications of tDCS, and both together seem to lag behind the academic mentions of tDCS. So who are these people known as do-it-yourselfers or home users? Well, there hasn't been too many studies of this movement. One was a survey, but there have been two. So one was a survey conducted by Anita Joie over at Stanford about 2 years ago, and she had 120 respondents. And I have done qualitative work interviewing DIYers and looking at their blogs, websites, and forums. So both of us found that mostly male, I mean overwhelmingly so. Most participants are in their 20s and 30s. It kind of clusters up here, but participants, it was actually surprising by how much they ranged in age, from teenagers to people in their 60s. The phenomenon is definitely global, though it seems to be clustered in the US and Canada. And one interesting report looked at whether neuroscientists engaged in researching tDCS to use tDCS on themselves for enhancement. I'm getting a nod over there. And yes, it found that for the most part, they did not use tDCS on themselves. Can you guys see, or am I blocking you over here? Okay. So why do these people do this stuff? Why do they stimulate their brains with electricity? Well, it kind of breaks along the same lines as why people research tDCS, so both for treatment and enhancement. So 59% stimulate for cognitive enhancement, 11% self-stimulate for treatment, and 24% self-stimulate for both enhancement and treatment. And this is according to the Stanford study. So again, both, so it mimics what the scientists are doing, both on clinical populations and on healthy populations. So taking a step back, I think what we have is a very interesting phenomenon and really fascinating for me, coming from the Science, Technology, and Society department, because we have two groups, or I should say at least two groups, there may be more groups, using the same technology, and sometimes they're using the exact same device, but they're using it in very different ways. So you have researchers using tDCS in the laboratory. And we have people here at Penn who study tDCS, applying tDCS to subjects for the primary purpose of research, and existing in a very controlled and regulated environment, right? So you have institutional review board approval, you have laboratory training, and you have all sorts of protocols. So it's a very controlled, very regulated space. And then at the same time, you have people using tDCS at home, applying tDCS to themselves. And whether they're doing it for enhancement or whether they're doing it for treatment, the purpose is still self-improvement, right? They're doing it to improve their self in some way, and existing in a completely uncontrolled environment. So this has created some tension, I would say, between the two groups, but it's a very interesting phenomenon to study, and one of the things I've looked at is the interaction between the two, and specifically how these home users draw upon published scientific literature. So this is what I'm going to go into the next part, so the practices of do-it-yourself brain stimulation. And so when scientists come to tDCS, they have a number of options. They can buy these devices from two device manufacturers right here, Neurocon and Soterix. These are investigational devices only sold to researchers. They cost many thousands of dollars. Scientists can also purchase iontophoresis devices, which are small current-giving machines, about the same size as this, maybe a little smaller. And they're actually used to treat excessive sweating, or they're used in drug delivery as well, and they can repurpose those for tDCS use. And those cost hundreds of dollars. So these are the really expensive ones. I don't have the inexpensive one pictured here. So, but again, these are sold only to researchers, and if you are a do-it-yourself or a home user and you're just coming to the world of tDCS, maybe you heard about it on Radiolab, or you read about it in Wired, and you want to try it, here are your options. So you can build the device yourself. That's what we have on the left here. Using, there's all these diagrams online, and you can just buy parts from a hardware store or on Amazon. There's a bunch of tDCS device kits, which range from $40 to $180. Kind of look like these, the cognitive kit that I showed you. These are mostly marketed for cognitive enhancement. Some are marketed for treatment. But they all kind of look like this, and they're mostly made by people involved in the do-it-yourself community. So often these people are posting on the Reddit forum. You can now buy a few devices that are either just marketed as tDCS devices or just as direct current sources. this is a picture of the iontophoresis device. You can buy one of these and repurpose it for tDCS use. So this is the same one that scientists sometimes use. There is one device that's been on the market for a while actually, designed for tDCS, that's sold from Hong Kong. And you have a few of these direct-to-consumer devices. So this one is called the Focus. This is an early version of the Focus. This is a headset that came out in 2013 for $249. I think, in my mind at least, that's the first real direct-to-consumer headset. So it looked really different from all the other things because there's no wires, nothing you really have to figure out. You could really just put it on your head, turn it on, and go. And then at the bottom below Focus, there's the Think device, which I showed you earlier. And the title of the talk, or the first part of the title, was from do-it-yourself to direct-to-consumer. So what began as this, right, people just making these devices in their homes, has now turned to the very rightmost column where you have these very sophisticated devices. Think has many millions of dollars, Silicon Valley startup. They're making really sophisticated stuff. And in between, you have this kind of murky area where it's not really clear what's a do-it-yourself device and what's direct-to-consumer. So that's why I kind of go between DIY, or when I'm speaking about this, I go between do-it-yourself and home user. Home user is probably a more accurate term because it captures the wider range of people using these devices. So when users look to purchase a tDCS device, they are mostly disconnected from the world of scientists, right? So the scientists buy their devices in their places, but do-it-yourselfers or home users look to a completely different place. But when home users look to apply stimulation or so they have the device and now they have to figure out what they're gonna do with it or how they're gonna use it, they really look to the scientific community for guidance. So they'll post scientific articles on the Reddit forum. They draw heavily on them, and when they're behind a firewall, they'll often post unrestricted copies of them. They use video tutorials on electrode positioning, such as that one, that are actually geared toward scientists. And for the most part, they actually adhere to scientific standards. So scientists, or at least I would say they try to. So scientists use this 10-20 system for electrode placement, which standardizes placement across individuals so that, of course, the results can be compared across different studies. And DIYers sometimes try to adhere to this in different ways. So some of them will try to be more exact with, actually using rulers or string, and some of them will just sort of guesstimate where to put the electrodes. And I should say that the placement of the electrodes, the specific orientation, is thought to be important for what sort of cognitive function you want to affect or maybe enhance. And for the most part, they adhere to this conventional current maximum of 2 milliamps that scientists use in their studies. DIYers often take the knowledge that's in scientific studies, right, these dense papers, and they transform them into these user-friendly guides and indexes that are geared towards their needs. So here you have a menu featuring different montage orientations. So that's the cathode, and that's the anode. And for a whole menu of different cognitive functions that you can enhance. Another thing that I thought is really interesting is that I found that where there were unknowns in scientific literature, or maybe uncertainties is the better word, DIYers really experiment and share their knowledge. That's sort of where they push the boundaries. So one of those areas is session length and frequency. So DIYers experiment with longer and more frequent sessions. And I love this quote. One individual wrote on the subreddit, the Reddit forum, that most studies never measure the point at which tDCS stops working. So you get a sense of the mindset of the home user, trying to really max out their cognitive enhancement abilities, where someone in a lab, is trying to design a study for a specific goal to find out more about brain function or learning, and is certainly not coming from that same viewpoint. Early on, now there are tDCS studies for pretty much every disease you can imagine. But early on, when they were just coming out, home users or DIYers would experiment and sort of extrapolate from existing studies to treat their own disorders. So one user posted that he extrapolated from a finding about depression to treat his bipolar disorder, and another self-treated for seasonal affective disorder and generalized anxiety disorder based on depression studies. Yeah?
Are you going to be talking about how these DIYers are measuring the results of their simulation?
I could mention that at the end if we have time. Actually, that was going to be my next slide, but I took it out for time. But I could go into that because I do have a paper that actually looks at the measuring. I will say very, very briefly though, because I don't have it on the slide, that so those who are interested in self-treating a disorder often take a subjective self-assessment. So they look, are they feeling better? If they're feeling better, then tDCS probably works. Most of them who are self-treating go with that. Those who are interested in cognitive enhancement, some of them rely on these subjective self-assessments, like did I do better? But I found that they try and quantify it more. And so some of them use studies that are freely available online, like dual MBAC studies or memory studies, and they'll take one, see how they did, and then sometimes they'll try to control for the practice effect. So sometimes they won't. So sometimes they'll take the same test again, and maybe they didn't get better, and then sometimes they'll take a different test. I also found though what was very interesting was that they make tests that are very personal. They often do this. They're like, so they'll play a video game or take a test, and they'll do it as far as they can until they hit a ceiling or until they hit a wall, and then they'll try tDCS and see if it gets them above the ceiling, and if they feel like it pushed them over, then they feel like tDCS worked. That was the gist of the other slides that I took out. So, why do we care about what these people are doing? Why is it interesting or useful to study? I think there's a number of reasons. One, I think it's important for scientists to understand that they do have this audience that's reading their work. It's an unintended audience maybe, but I think it's something for tDCS researchers to definitely be aware of. I think that rather than dismissing the whole do-it-yourself endeavor, I think there's some small kernels of value to be gleaned from these DIY reports. For example, at least one company I know is hoping that tDCS in the future is approved as a treatment for depression, and they're hoping that tDCS maybe could be a therapy that's used at home but supervised by a physician remotely. So maybe the patient will have to put in a PIN code to receive tDCS. And I think just looking at what sort of obstacles DIYers or home users encounter could really inform, the future use of tDCS, if it ever comes to that, in the home use therapeutic context. I think it's also interesting for thinking about how scientists or other people can engage with DIYers or home users. So the fact that they're looking to science, looking up to science, and looking to science for guidance, I think is really unique and important. So there are other DIY movements like DIY Bio, for example, which that movement's more about making a statement against the sequestration of science in academia. So they want science to sort of be everywhere and for everybody. And DIY tDCS doesn't really have that same, there's not that same thought, I guess. They're really looking up to scientists and really drawing upon scientific knowledge. And so I think they're open and receptive to communication or guidelines from scientists. And finally, I think it's useful for assessing regulatory proposals. And just for example, and this will take us into the next part about regulation, which is fun stuff. But I think keeping in mind the complexity of the devices and the range of devices that are on the market today is really important when thinking about regulation. So tDCS, a consumer tDCS device is not one thing. You really have all different kinds of things from these do-it-yourself devices to direct-to-consumer ones, to iontophoresis devices, to devices marketing themselves as a direct current source. And that's something that I think people should keep in mind when thinking about regulation and perhaps regulatory proposals. So, on to the regulation, which is good stuff. And I should say that the FDA, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, the FDA has not taken any action against these devices. It has not issued a formal statement about whether or not it's going to regulate these devices as medical devices. So there are about a dozen devices right now, and what is interesting is that Think, this one device right here, according to the company, Think submitted a request for information from the FDA about how the FDA would classify it, and the FDA said that because Think was marketed for recreational purposes, it would not be classified as a medical device. So Think has existed on the market. So basically there has been no regulatory action taken from the FDA against any of these devices. But we'll get more into the regulation now. So several scholars have pointed to the fact that these devices, right, like the ones right here, are on the market, and the fact that there has been no regulation, and some have concluded that there's a regulatory gap or a lack of regulation. And to address that regulatory gap, they've argued that we need to modify medical device law or make exceptions to medical device law or somehow do something so that these devices are very clearly covered under existing medical device law. I have a different approach, and I'll lay out my argument right here at the beginning. So I think people have erroneously concluded that there's a lack of regulation, and I think they may have conflated the lack of enforcement with the lack of regulation. So just because the FDA hasn't enforced existing regulations doesn't mean that the regulations don't exist. So I think we have to keep in mind that the FDA is an agency of about 11,000 people. It regulates the entirety of food, drugs, cosmetics, and medical devices in the United States. That's billions and billions of dollars worth of products. And they can't possibly enforce every regulation against every single thing. Another way of thinking about it is that, in an ideal hypothetical model of the law, every legal violation would be prosecuted, right? But that doesn't happen, and just because that doesn't happen, that doesn't mean the law isn't there, right? So I think we just need to be careful when talking about the lack of enforcement and the lack of regulation. Other people have said that these devices are unregulated, and again, I think we just also need to be careful there. So if they're not regulated as medical devices, they are regulated as consumer devices. And we will get into that. So my approach is to take a kind of grounded, more pragmatic approach. So rather than looking into what level of regulation, how can we make sure that these devices get regulated, I look at the actual device market, which is kind of what we did in part one, and look specifically at how medical device law applies to these devices on the market. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of the talk, pretty much. So, is a consumer non-invasive brain stimulation device a medical device? That really cuts to the heart of the question, right? So to answer that, we need to look at the definition of medical device. So, according to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a medical device is, we're going to skip over some of the legalese, but basically an instrument, apparatus. And for our purposes, these two prongs are very important. Intended for the use in diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. And the third prong, intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. So these are the two main prongs of the definition of a medical device. And what's really interesting is that the definition of a medical device is not based on how the device works, right? It doesn't say a medical device is an instrument that is used in the diagnosis of disease. It says intended for use. And that intended for clause is really interesting, and actually everything sort of centers around this, what intended for means. But it's not mechanism of action. So how does the FDA define intended use, or this intended for language? So luckily, it sets it out for us in a very long paragraph. The words intended uses refer to the objective intent of the persons legally responsible for the labeling of the devices. It's basically a fancy legal way of saying the manufacturers of the devices. And this objective intent may be shown by labeling claims and advertising matter. And other stuff, some of which we'll get to later. But basically, intended use has shown by, so basically how a manufacturer markets its product on the labeling and on the advertising of its product, that determines how the product is classified. So to a large degree, the manufacturer can control whether or not his or her, or its, maybe a better word, product is a medical device. And this is important actually in many industries, not the very tiny world of, not just the very tiny world of consumer brain stimulation. But let's take a look, for example, at the line between drugs and cosmetics. Both are regulated by the FDA. Drugs, however, have to demonstrate safety and efficacy before going to market. So that means clinical trials. That means many millions of dollars, usually. It means many years. I mean, it's a serious endeavor to get a new drug to market. A cosmetic, by contrast, doesn't have to demonstrate safety or efficacy before going to market. Just goes to market. The FDA can take certain action if it, after a cosmetic is on the market. And the line between the two can get very murky, I guess, depending on how the manufacturer, so basically how the manufacturer markets the device, the specific words really make all the difference, right? So if you have a cream that claims to reduce wrinkles, this is sort of the classic example, that's considered a drug, whereas reduces the appearance of wrinkles, that's a claim about beauty, that's a cosmetic. Sunscreen lotion is a drug, suntan lotion is a cosmetic. And even things that you'll see on the same aisle, right next to each other on the shelf, maybe at CVS or wherever, completely different regulatory pathway. So on the left we have an antiperspirant, that's a drug. You could see that common over-the-counter drug label that you all recognize, a little fuzzy on the screen. And then on the right here we have deodorant, which is a cosmetic. Anti-gingivitis mouthwash, that's a drug. Just your regular old mint mouthwash, that's a cosmetic. So the border is very thin, but has huge implications. So just the wording can really have a major effect. And so on that slide I talked about different products. You could also have the same exact product that is marketed for different indications that's regulated differently based on how it's marketed. So a great example is a treadmill. So a treadmill marketed for use in hospitals or medical facilities, that's a medical device that's regulated by the FDA. A treadmill for recreational use that you have in your basement at your house, or that they have at the gym, that's a recreational device, and that's regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Again, completely different regulatory pathway, so you do have products that have dual uses. And again, how the manufacturer represents it really means everything. So given the importance of how the manufacturer represents its products, why don't we take a look at how tDCS products have represented themselves, their marketing claims, essentially. Here's a sampling of most of them. There are new ones coming out on the market every day, so there's a few ones that aren't on here. So at the top we have the brain stimulator. So tDCS allows you to unlock your true potential. Focus, make your synapses fire faster, overclock your brain, take charge. Charge your mind, power your mind, be happier, be focused. So a lot of these themes have to do with cognitive enhancement or brain optimization. So unleashing what's already there, making it better. There are some devices that do market themselves specifically for medical treatment, and there are some devices that just market themselves as a current source, or this one at the bottom, super specific devices, just markets itself as a personal tDCS device. So with that in mind, let's go back to the definition of what a medical device is. Let's take each prong, those two prongs, we'll take them one by one. So, intended for use in the diagnosis of disease and other conditions. So some products, as I said, I'm not going to name them by name, but there are products out there that do make medical claims, and those products would very clearly be medical devices under the FDA. So this is an example of one. Finally, there is a drug, this is from one of their websites, finally there is a drug-free DIY method to increase concentration as well as relief for depression, anxiety, and migraines. So that last part is very clearly making a medical claim. Interestingly, the only instance of regulatory action to date against one of these consumer brain stimulation devices has not come from the FDA. It's come from the California Department of Public Health. And 2 years ago, in 2013, they took action against a device called tDCS Home Device Kit because they claimed the device was misbranded. Basically, the device was making medical claims. Now, to make a medical claim, you don't have to say, my device will treat depression. You could say that my device is a tDCS device, and they had this text right here. Clinical therapy using tDCS, blah, blah, blah. There have been therapeutic effects shown in clinical trials involving Parkinson's disease, fibromyalgia, post-stroke, depression, anxiety disorders, and schizophrenia. So basically, it was acknowledging that its device was a tDCS device, and also saying that tDCS device has been shown to have therapeutic effects for a variety of disorders and diseases. And that was enough to be considered a medical claim. Now, there are gray areas. There are some manufacturers that link to research. So if you say that tDCS has been shown to have beneficial effects for a variety of indications, that's probably going to, and you specify those indications, that's probably going to be a medical device. But there's a very murky area where what if you just link to those studies? Or what if you just mention that there's research on tDCS for depression, but you don't say that it's been effective? So it's really unclear. Yeah, sir?
This has a parallel to cherry oaks, which went out of their way to just say we have oat bran these things, and yet it's not going to be Cheerios. What's the legal difference?
I'm not familiar with that. Can you further explain that one?
In the packaging area for food and stuff, it's just a common way around it. So they Cheerios in boxes, some parts on it, all that sort of stuff, and they say, it has oat bran in it, but they don't make any specific claims, but they often do note that oat bran has been shown to have beneficial effects for heart disease. And FDA's never gone after. I just didn't know if it was.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure what because food also is regulated slightly, has a completely different set of regulations, but it could be and it could not be. It could be that the FDA just hasn't enforced the regulations against that, or it could be that in that industry that's known to be okay. I'm not sure. But here, this is at least one example where there has been a regulatory agency that has taken action against the device manufacturer. So, but yeah, I mean, there's very unclear areas, and there's a bunch of devices that, it's unclear if they could be considered medical claims. And each of those claims would really have to be reviewed in their own context and looking at what else is on the website, what kind of devices they are, so you'd really have to look at each one individually. So taking a look at this other prong, so intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of men or other animals. This is a great one. This is often forgotten because most people think that a medical device is only something that's used to treat disease or disease or medical related, but this one is really interesting, right? And at first glance, it seems like a tDCS device very clearly falls under this definition, right? Because it's using electricity to affect, through the body, specifically the brain, to affect cognitive function. So, most people say, well, yeah, this is clearly a tDCS device. But if you take a step back and kind of think about it, well, everything is intended to. So many devices out there, probably half the things in this room would be medical devices. Shoes, chairs, treadmills. Treadmills is just a great one, so I love coming back to it. Beds, backpack. I mean, everything affects the structure or function of the body, but not everything is a medical device, right? So there were 3 cases in the 1960s related to wrinkle remover creams, where the courts clarified that and these are my words at the end here, that not any structure or function claim, not any intent. So when I say structure or function claim, that's an intended use claim related to structure or function that maybe a manufacturer makes. So not any claim can be considered a structure or function claim. There has to be some kind of medical or therapeutic connotation. So another way of thinking about it is intended to affect the structure or function of the body, but really for some kind of medical or therapeutic purpose. And there was a very interesting case in 2002 that clarified this medical or therapeutic purpose reading of the statute. And that was in the case of Verichip. So Verichip made RFID chips, so radio frequency identification. These were implantable chips. And the company had the same chip, but wanted to have two different products. One was to be used just in health applications, so I think it was going to have your health files on it. Another one was just for personal security and identification, so maybe getting into the house or unlocking a hotel room, things like that. And the company wrote to the FDA and said, how are you going to classify these two different products that we have? And the head of the chief counsel of the FDA at the time, Daniel Troy, this was in 2002, wrote that assuming that no medical claims are made for this personal ID chip, and the product marketed for that purpose contains no health information, the FDA can confirm that it's not a medical device. So even though this product was, implantable, clearly we would think that it's intended to affect the structure or function of the body in some way. The one for personal security applications was not considered to be a medical device, but the one that had health applications was. So another thing that we can look at when thinking about whether these are medical devices is at the claims of these companies, right? So what are they marketing these things for? So again, looking at this language, power your mind, increase your brain's plasticity, it's hard to read here, but beat stress, increase your attention span, would those claims be considered intended uses related to affect the structure or function of the body in a medical way, or would they be considered medical claims? What about that wording? What do we make of that? And the FDA actually has been kind of struggling this for a while because there's a lot of these mobile medical health applications that are out now, all these new wearable technology devices that have really similar marketing tactics, promotes healthy sleep, things like that. And the FDA was basically under pressure to address the regulatory status of all these things, devices that were coming out. So in January 2015, it issued a general wellness policy for low-risk device draft guidance, which basically the FDA issues these guidances every so often, which reflect its thinking to industry. These guidances are not binding in any way. They're just these sort of, again, reflections of what the FDA is thinking to industry. And I should really emphasize that this was the draft version. So this was one that was posted for public comment and open for public comment. But it's useful, at least, I think, to see where the FDA is coming from or what it's thinking. And it said that general wellness products that present a low risk to safety will not be regulated by the FDA as medical devices. And it defined as a general wellness device as one that makes claims related to maintaining or encouraging a general state of health without making references to diseases or conditions. And it gave a few examples. Mental acuity, these are examples of acceptable wellness claims. So those relating to mental acuity, concentration, problem solving, relaxation, and stress management. So at first glance, it seems like a tDCS device maybe could be a general wellness product. Those are the kinds of claims it's making. Yeah?
I was curious about the low risk safety component, like how do we do that?
Next slide. So a product is not a low-risk device. Not a low-risk device if it involves an intervention or a technology that may pose a risk to a user's safety if device controls are not applied. Let that sink in, right? What does that mean? So it gave a number of examples of devices. None of them were electrical brain stimulation devices, so it really kind of left the field open with regard to electrical brain stimulation. And that's the question, are these low risk? Are these devices considered low risk devices? So on the one hand, these devices, so in over 10,000 subjects that have been studied to date, there has been no serious adverse reactions. There are consistent side effects such as tingling, surface burning, headache, not major burns, just redness, tingling, things like that. And that's something that, so those results are from the lab, and also in my work, at least studying the do-it-yourself or home use community, I haven't seen anybody mention any serious adverse reactions, but there are a lot of these side effects, the burning and the tingling. So it depends what you consider low risk. One thing that could weigh in on this is it's interesting to think about the decision by the FDA not to regulate think because it was marketed for recreational uses. So I think that seems to indicate that maybe it's not considering these devices as risky devices, but it's really unclear.
Imagine like maybe some populations that have low seizure threshold, whether that issue is
Correct. Yeah. And that's a big question. I'm going to come to that later too, but that's definitely a question. Although I'm not sure how the FDA's regulation of that would prevent people who have, let's say, epilepsy or low seizure threshold from using the device. I mean, maximum there would be a warning label on the device. But hopefully you'd be aware of that anyway before you put a brain stimulation device on your head. So, but another thing is, where does the FDA get its authority to regulate based on risk, right? So, in that draft guidance, it said if the general wellness products presenting a low risk to safety will not be regulated as medical devices. But how does it have the authority to regulate based on risk? Because if we look back at the definition of a medical device, it's all about the marketing. It says nothing about risk, right? It's all about the intended use. So the FDA's mission, Congress set up the FDA to protect and promote public health. And various cases have shown that courts are often willing to allow the FDA significant leeway in its statutory interpretation based on its overall mandate to protect public health. And this usually only comes in cases where there's very significant public health risk. So in one case in 1969, there was a product called Bacto Unidisc. And at this time, this was prior to the medical device amendment. So medical devices at that time were allowed to pretty much just go straight to market without demonstrating safety or efficacy, but drugs had more stringent regulations, so they at that time had to demonstrate safety and efficacy before going to market. So there was an antibiotic sensitivity disc, I believe that's what it's called Bacto Unidisc. Most of us today probably would say that's a device. I mean, it is a device. But the FDA decided to regulate it as a drug because it wanted to put it under more stringent regulation. Even though, and the company basically argued, no, we're a device. The case went to court, and the court sided with the FDA, saying that because the FDA is here to protect public health, we're going to allow the FDA to regulate what is really a device as a drug. So in some cases, again, the FDA can appeal to its mandate to protect public health. I think it's really unlikely that it would do so in this case because there has not been a significant public health risk demonstrated. So what about devices that make no claim at all, like this one? So no claim, it's just a direct current source. It's quite an expensive one, $749. Would the FDA have any authority to take action here? Well, if we go back to this meaning of intended uses where the FDA defined it, so again, the FDA has historically really just looked at advertising and labeling claims, but technically, it can look at a lot of other things when determining intended use. And the interesting ones for our purposes today are it can look at circumstances surrounding the distribution of the article, which is extremely broad. It could pretty much mean anything. Or oral and written statements by such persons, meaning the manufacturers or their representatives. So potentially, the FDA could look at statements that these people have been making, manufacturers have been making maybe on the Reddit forum, maybe elsewhere, if it wants to determine an intended use, if it wants to classify these things as a medical device. I think that would be very unusual and quite a stretch, but the FDA is certainly within its power to do so. Another thing that has been brought up is whether, so if you have a device like this, let's say it's not making any claims at all, but let's say everybody is using it for self-treatment, would the FDA have any authority to take action there? And this was actually brought up whether, so the question is whether foreseeable use or the way that consumers actually use the product, could that stand in for intended use, absent any claims on the part of the manufacturer? So this was brought up with relations to cigarettes, which is a very interesting story related to intended use and medical device and regulation. It's been a long battle to regulate cigarettes. And in the 1970s, there was a citizen action group called Action on Smoking and Health, and they wanted the FDA to regulate cigarettes. But the FDA said, we're not going to regulate cigarettes because the manufacturers of cigarettes, they're not making any specific medical-related or health claims. And this group said, well, the way that consumers are using these devices, the actual uses of them, they're using them to affect the structure or function of the body. By delivering nicotine to the body, they're affecting the structure or function of the body. And this group said that therefore, these should be considered medical devices. So again, the FDA refused, saying that manufacturers had not made any health claims. It went to court. The court basically said that to have actual or foreseeable use stand in for intended use, the bar is really high. You'd have to show that consumers were using this for nearly exclusively for a given intention, and it would be almost impossible to prove it. So it's pretty unlikely that actual or foreseeable use could stand in here. And in the letter about the VeriChip, the RFID chip that I mentioned earlier, the FDA Chief Counsel Daniel Troy also brought up the issue of foreseeability and said foreseeability by the manufacturer does not suffice to establish intended use. Rather, there must be objective intent in the form of marketing claims. So just to sum up all these things we've talked about. So if a product makes in its advertising or marketing, if it's making explicit disease claims, if it's making structure or function claims that are medically related or have some medical connotation, if it's making implied medical claims, it's clearly within FDA jurisdiction as a medical device. If a product makes only wellness claims or no claims at all, it would be unusual, but the FDA could look to circumstances surrounding the distribution or other factors to establish intended use. It could maybe appeal to its statutory mandate to protect public health. It's probably be unlikely. And even if these devices are not considered medical devices, there are multiple authorities in the US that regulate consumer devices. So there's the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates unfair or deceptive business practices, but it interprets unfair or deceptive very broadly. So if you're selling a hazardous product without adequate warning, you might fall under FTC regulation. And the FTC has recently taken action against a whole bunch of manufacturers that make claims related to cognitive enhancement. Most recently in July, there was a company claiming that their product would restore 10 to 15 years of memory loss. In previous cases, it's taken action against various games that claim to have cognitive enhancing effects. So the FTC has sort of stepped up in this cognitive enhancement realm and has taken action. So if a consumer if these are considered consumer devices, I think the most natural place for them to fall, at least partly, I'd say, would be the FTC. There's also the Consumer Product Safety Commission that sets safety standards for a variety of devices. So cribs, table saws, I think carbon monoxide detectors, that's all Consumer Product Safety Commission, and treadmills too. The FCC regulates certain wireless aspects of these devices, so both the Focus, one of the direct-to-consumer devices that I showed you earlier, and the Think, they communicate with Bluetooth, via Bluetooth to smartphones, and that has been regulated by the FCC. They've had to get FCC certification prior to going to market. The Better Business Bureau is not a non-governmental organization, but it has stepped in at least one case, helping a consumer with the dispute against the Focus device, one of the direct-to-consumer devices. And finally, there's lots of state laws. Like I mentioned earlier, the California Department of Health took action against one tDCS device and basically effectively shut the manufacturer down. So in my last talk, I was called a regulatory nihilist, so I want to clarify that I do think there are some concerns. So there are long-term unknown effects of tDCS. Again, in scientific studies, they look mostly at the short-term effects, studies on learning. There are studies in clinical populations that have been looking at longer effects, but there's really no long-term studies of frequent use of tDCS in healthy populations, and we don't really know if that has a bad effect or not. There could be certain cognitive trade-offs, so if you're enhancing one region, maybe you are impairing effects in another. There's at least one study that's been published indicating something along those lines. My view on that is I sort of interpret that cautiously. I make cognitive trade-offs every day. I think about using Facebook, and that's certainly a cognitive trade-off, how much time I want to spend doing certain things, or using the iPhone, or other cognitive trade-offs. Use on children, I think, is a really big one. There's a lot to say about this, but children using the device and parents using it on our children are both potentially really big ethical issues and really interesting and scary territory. Interaction with drugs and other conditions. So yeah, we don't know. I mean, tDCS there have been no adverse reactions yet, but there may be, like you said. And in scientific studies of tDCS, people with epilepsy are usually excluded from the study, so there's probably not much data on the effects of tDCS on those populations. But I do want to point out that regulation regulates the device, not the user. So even if we had regulation or further regulation on these devices, I'm not sure that any of these issues would be solved. I think we'd still be facing a lot of them. So, I think that a device like Think right here has enough money and has resources to comply with regulation, and they've published safety and efficacy studies on their device. So even, let's say, that was regulated as a medical device, which I don't think they would have to really do much else. I think we'd still be left with a lot of these questions right here, and what do we do about those? There's still issues that will be left. So, what do we do? Well, one thing is I think it's important for scientists to give some sort of guidelines to the DIY or home use community, basically stating, what's known, what are the knowns and what are the unknowns about tDCS use. I think we really need studies to monitor these potential long-term safety issues and even more subtle impairment issues. I think we need some enforcement clarity about whether these devices, right now it's just a big question mark, right? Is the FDA going to be stepping up for certain devices and the FTC for others? Is the FDA going to decide to really go in aggressively in this area and maybe send out some warning letters to some of the device manufacturers? I think it would be helpful just to know which agency is really going to take regulatory responsibility. And there is an FDA meeting about this in 2 weeks, so it's all happening now. And I just think we need to keep a grounded perspective. There's brain stimulation, especially on the head, makes us really uncomfortable. There's something about it that's just kind of like, it's just disturbing or unsettling in some way. But keeping a grounded perspective, this do-it-yourself movement, again, started a few years ago. It hasn't taken off really in the general population yet. And I think just really keeping an eye on it, using multiple methods of analysis, so studying the population, really keeping an eye on the devices that are coming out, and studying this phenomenon from multiple angles, and not being too alarmist about everything that's going on, So it hasn't sent anybody, we don't know the long-term effects, but in the short term, there really haven't, it's relatively safe, I would say. And just to give you a bit of a peek, this is just a project I'm working on now, looking at the history of the home use of stimulation on the body and the brain. And actually about 100 years ago, the consumer use of stimulation or home stimulation was extremely popular, much more popular than it is today, actually. So there was probably almost 100 companies selling these devices. And again, there were the same tensions between, it wasn't researchers and home users, but it was physicians and home users. So I'm really excited about this project that I have coming up. And that's it. Thank you very much.